Who's the Q guy, huh?
There's the Q guy. All right, thanks. Welcome back. We're starting out with our Gospel according to St. Mark. If you were with us for the last Bible study, you know we finished halfway through our in-person session. So go ahead and pause the video and say your own prayer if you'd like to, and then come back and join us. We're going to dive straight into the Gospel according to Mark. So I gave you a lot of info this time. So I'm going to summarize a lot of this. We don't know a whole lot about the writing, the author, the provenance. We can narrow the time down to about 65 to 75 CE. That puts Mark as the first chronologically gospel, but not the first of the writings. So depending on who's dating Paul's letters might date back to as early as 41 or as early as the early 50s. Paul finishes writing in 56 because he's arrested in Caesarea, 56, 57, and from there on he heads off to Rome where he supposedly is executed. We get the details, most of the details at the end of his life in Acts, but not from Paul's own words. So Paul actually gives us, interestingly enough, because Paul was not there, was not participating in following the physical living Jesus before his crucifixion, and yet he gives us the first writings, the earliest writings about Jesus, at least that we still have today. Mark gives us the first gospel. And as you can see from the little timeline on there, pretty much everything else we have comes after that.
Do people believe, or does the history suggest that Paul was in the vicinity of the crucifixion at the time of the crucifixion?
I don't know that there is any information on that. And we know that Paul comes on the scene after Jesus has died and he's persecuting the followers of Jesus.
But there's nothing to suggest he was part of this. Well, he was persecuting people.
Yeah.
Especially the Jewish people. But there's nothing to suggest historically that he was in the area of the crucifixion.
Nothing tells us one way or the other. So one thing to keep in mind is that Jesus dies at roughly the age of 33, give or take a couple of years, somewhere around the year 33, give or take a couple of years. Paul's earliest Christian writings are maybe 41, probably based on what I think are the more rigorous scholars, probably closer to the year 50. We're talking about a difference of 17 years in a culture where people live to typically around 40, maybe 50. I mean, some people live to 70 and 80, but average life expectancy was much shorter. And Paul identifies himself as a student of the Rabbi Gamaliel, and so he would have likely started his academic studies under the rabbi maybe around the age of 11 or 12. So he's not even off to persecute Christians until he's probably at least 20. And to have the position that he had where we hear about him persecuting Stephen, he's actually not the one who throws the stones, but rather he's directing others in the community. So he's already achieved some level of accomplishment and success in his position in the Jewish religious circles, which suggests he's not fresh out of college, right? So we don't know anything about Paul's age, but more likely than not, that by the time he's persecuting Stephen, he's probably 25-ish. And then he starts writing his letters maybe around the year 50. Presumably, there's not a huge amount of time between the persecution of Stephen and when he writes his letters. So at the time that, more likely than not, and you'd have to sit down and break down the timeline, more likely than not, at the time of Jesus' crucifixions, there's a good chance that Paul's somewhere around the age of 10, I mean, the gap on that's pretty big. That's give or take maybe a standard deviation of 8 or 10 years, which means it's entirely within the realm of possibility that Paul isn't even born when Jesus dies, and he's just really young when he starts writing, or that Paul was born before Jesus, was already in his mid-30s. Those are all possible, but more likely than not, he was somewhere around the age of 10, give or take a few years. So if Paul knows what's going on with Jesus, it's not a first-hand adult account, at least not the way we define an adult, probably. Also, and that fits in with the fact that Paul tends to be looked down upon by the other disciples, which would suggest that there's a good chance he was younger. Of course, it could just be because he's a late comer to the faith compared to them. So, okay, so that's the timeline. Providence, we have no idea where this was written. There's some interesting things going on with the linguistics, and we'll talk about those in a sec, that actually does suggest that Mark might be someone who is in or near the vicinity of Hebrew and Aramaic speakers. So he's probably not a Roman. The linguistics are interesting because the scholars suggest that Mark is neither a native Greek speaker nor a native Aramaic speaker, which kind of makes you wonder, what exactly was he? Because those were the two dominant languages for probably several hundred miles in every direction around Israel, around Jerusalem. So it really depends on which scholar you're reading. But one of the interesting characteristics of the gospel is that there's one place where there are a couple places in particular where Paul's Greek sentence structure kind of starts to collapse for students of Greek. He's an okay writer in Greek. He falls back on what seems to be a fairly small vocabulary. He uses the same conjunction over and over again. The Gospel according to Mark is the smallest of the Gospels, and he uses the word "and" in Greek, kai, something like 1,070 some times, which is a lot. And there's a lot of other conjunctions that you can use in Greek, but Mark doesn't use them. So that's part of why they suggest maybe he's not a native Greek speaker. But his Greek is particularly choppy, particularly rough, in most of the places where he's quoting Jesus. What's really interesting about that is there have been some linguistic scholars who have taken those Greek quotations of Jesus and have made wooden translations of the Greek into Aramaic. And they make better Aramaic sentences than they make Greek sentences, or at least that's the argument. The implication, at least that some scholars have made, is that the fact that specifically the quotations of Jesus are worse Greek sentences than they are Aramaic sentences, if you just translate them word for word, would suggest that whoever originally documented those sentences, those quotations, was probably doing it from very recent memory or in the moment that they were being said. In other words, there is an argument within the biblical scholastic community that when Jesus speaks in Mark, we're actually getting a Greek translation of the actual words that Jesus said, and that the person who originally translates them into Greek heard Jesus say them. That seems to be the implication. So, now of course we don't know that that's all speculation based on the evidence in the text. But it is definitely interesting. Now, I've given you a chart, and for those online, this is Appendix A, Early Christian Literature, out of Who Wrote the Bible? By Bert and Matt, which kind of highlights all of the different sources. So you can find Paul's letters. So this is a scholar who lists Paul's letters in right around 55. So he's got a later start time. And but you'll see that there's a bunch of other sources for what he's calling early Christian literature. Of course, Christian literature in here, if you look at the 40s, you have what's called oral tradition. That wasn't written down. So remember that literature in this context is saying the oral traditions count as literature. So you get Jesus in the 20s, the 20s, and you get the teachings around love coming in the 30s, and then oral traditions, none of which we have any way of knowing directly how that ties in. Then in the 50s, we get some additional material, and this is where Q, this text that we
Can't find.
can't find, it doesn't exist anymore, but the evidence in the Gospels, where the Gospels copy each other and where they don't copy each other, and it's a whole complex explanation of it. We start to see that some kind of early Christian writing that we've lost, that's been lost to time, but that gets used to write our Gospels, or at least two of our Gospels, is probably somewhere around the 50s or 60s. And that, along with stories about miracles and the oral traditions and other stories, are what we eventually get that get compiled together to create the Gospel according to Mark. And then a lot of this, and then from there, a lot of other things then bleed into the other Gospels and writings that we get after that fact. So in some ways, Paul runs pretty isolated off on his own, writing his own things, and the Gospel according to Mark is coming out of a somewhat different tradition.
This Q guy has arrows going from him to almost everybody.
Yeah, so Q is, well, in Q, the speculative source Q, we think it probably went through a couple different rewrites over the time. But Q primarily influences the synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, maybe Luke. And that's how that's why we have a good reason to believe that Q existed at some point. And in a written form, because Mark and Matthew in particular tend to quote pretty heavily from Q. And so the thing that tells us that Q probably existed is that Matthew and Mark tend to quote verbatim the same stories. Now, of course, the argument then is, well, then how come we don't just think that Matthew copied from Mark? Well, sometimes Matthew differs from Mark, and when Matthew differs from Mark, weirdly enough, Matthew and Luke agree, which suggests there's a source that they share in common, and each book sometimes differs from the source.
Do we have physical? Where's this Gospel of Thomas?
We have, I can't remember if we have a full copy of it. I think we do. The Gospel of Thomas is, calling it a gospel is a little bit of a misnomer, because it's more of a collection of quotes. It's more like the wisdom literature that we've been reading, but the implication is that these were things Jesus said. A few of them are in terms of things Jesus did, but they're all like just short blurbs stacked together.
What made the explosion of all this writing in basically 20 years, from 80 or 75 to 100?
So that's where, when we get to, we get Mark, Matthew, Thomas, and Paul's letters, and then we get suddenly an explosion right before the turn of the century of writings. And what you're largely seeing there is the formation of the church as an organization.
So the Christian faith was becoming more prevalent, so that there were more people addressing the theology of Christ.
I would say the distinction is that it's becoming more organized. When we start getting close to the turn of the century, we start to get groups like the Gnostics and the Marcions, who eventually are labeled as heretics, who start espousing certain beliefs and opinions about Christianity and about Jesus that the mainstream Christians of the time find problematic. And that triggers an effort to organize and concentrate the teachings about Jesus and Christianity into a more deliberate structure for how we look at Christianity, how we are the church together. And so that's where you get a bubble of writings. And of course, also, the later you get, the more likely texts are to survive. So we're going to have more texts from later dates as well. Because we're pretty sure there are a bunch of other letters Paul wrote, and we just don't have them, for example. But also, and I'd have to double check the dates, somewhere in this time frame between 60 and 120, you get a couple Roman emperors who are pretty active about persecuting Christians. They're usually it's usually a short-lived persecution. I mean, it feels long when you're in the middle of it, but most of the time we're probably talking 2-3 years. And often those persecutions were not, go get every Christian you can find and wipe them out. They were like, hey, you know those Christians in that town, they're annoying me? Go do something about it. So the Christian persecution in the Bible gets exaggerated a little bit.
Who or what is Charisma?
That one I might have to look up. Where is that one?
In the 50, AD 50 or...
That's a Greek
He
word.
influences,
Yeah,
or whatever it is, influences Paul and Mark.
I'd have to go back and look at what Burton Mack says about that. That's I don't think that's a name. I think that's a Greek word, and I don't recognize that one off the top of my head. So I'd actually have to look that one up. Ask me that again next week, and hopefully I will have the answer. Okay, so enough on that. The author is interesting because Mark's not a disciple. He's not listed as one of the followers of Jesus. So how does his name end up on a gospel? Well, as early as the late 1st, early 2nd century, this gospel gets the name Mark applied to it, even though the author never identifies himself. He doesn't even use the attributive pronoun of I or we in this gospel. So Paul is not writing as if he's giving a first-person account. And yet we get this name that's not one of the disciples applied to it pretty early on. And so there's some arguments that maybe the guy who really wrote this is actually Mark. We don't know who that is. There's mention of a Mark who goes around with Paul, so maybe it's that Mark? We don't know.
So there's actual physical script of the original Mark writings?
Probably not. Depends on which scholar you're following. So some scholars argue that the version of Mark that we have today is a separate book from what the original author of Mark wrote in the first place. That at one point there was a proto-Mark, a gospel according to Mark that we just no longer have anymore. And that what we have is what someone else wrote using his writings as their primary source, or maybe even their only source. But Mark, when we look at the linguistics, we look at the dates of authorship. And if we include the possibility that whoever this Mark figure is might have lived longer than the average life expectancy, which he definitely could have, many of the disciples, at least according to tradition, did. There is a possibility that the actual author of Mark was somebody who was there when Jesus walked around. Maybe he got these quotes from somebody else. Maybe he was actually physically present. And one of the biblical arguments, one of the arguments scholars make is to look at, and this is the last paragraph on your front page, is to look at these 3 particular places where we have a strange man who shows up. And in at least one of those cases, the purpose of the man in the Bible just doesn't make any sense. And that's the story of the rich man who asked Jesus, how do I inherit? So this is your first lesson on Mark. Mark might have situated himself in the Bible. So we get the story in chapter 10 where the rich man comes to Jesus and says, Jesus, how do I inherit the kingdom? And Jesus basically goes through the commandments and says, have you done that? And he goes, yes, I have. He says, then you only have one thing left to do. Give away everything that you own. And then come and follow me. He walks away, and the rich man walks away sad because he has much. Okay? Which seems to suggest that he didn't follow Jesus' advice. I can't do that. And walked off. But it doesn't say that. It just says that he walked away sad. Then, a couple chapters later, in chapter 14, we get this scene where Jesus is arrested in the garden. Right? This is getting towards the end. And Jesus gets arrested, and all of his followers scatter. They abandon Jesus. And then for some reason, there's some young man who's there, and the Romans, they grab the robe that he's wearing, and it falls off of him, and he runs away naked. Why does Mark not bother to mention that? Does he just feel that, the story just wasn't complete up to this point without a naked man? So I just need to throw a naked man in the story? It seems so random and out of the blue, right? To suggest...
Unless it really happened.
Unless it really happened, or unless that's supposed to be a specific person who has specific meaning to the community of people who are reading this story or hearing this story, right? But what's interesting about that story then in the garden is this young man who loses his robe and runs away naked suddenly has nothing. He's given away everything. So if the rich man in 10 is the same as the young man mentioned in 14, then the rich man who couldn't fulfill the obligation, maybe in the course of those 4 chapters, did actually give everything away, and all he had left were the clothes on his back. And by giving up his robe, having it taken from him by the Romans, when he ran away, he did in fact give away everything, and he was following Jesus. Then, Mark is the only gospel that has a human being present at the resurrection other than the disciples or the women who followed Jesus. And that's a young man who is sitting inside the tomb, who is, in the gospel according to Mark, the first actual witness to the resurrection. So it may be, and some scholars argue, that Mark, either because he was actually there, and this did all actually happen, or because as the author he's choosing to, has situated himself in these 3 stories. And why 3? Because one of the things we'll see if we're paying attention as we're reading through Mark, 3 is a really important number for the gospel according to Mark. Almost everything in Mark happens in 3s. So 3 stories about Mark, or whoever this unnamed young man is, who apparently was pretty significant as the first person to be at the resurrection. Oh, also it's worth noting that in the original ending to Mark tells, or the young man in the tomb tells the disciples, or tells the women to tell the disciples to go back to Galilee where they first met Jesus, and that Jesus will see them there, but they run away scared and tell no one. So that means Mark is the only person, or excuse me, not Mark, the young man in the tomb is the only person left to tell the story, which he does when he writes the book. Or others have argued the reason that in Mark the disciples all run away scared and never tell anyone is because the audience is supposed to take on that responsibility.
The young man, let's say he was 20 or 25, would have been in his 50s then when he wrote the book. Maybe 60s. The young man, the Greek word they used for young man in Mark which would be at the end of the very end of the gospel, would make him an unmarried man between the ages of roughly 25 and 40. Oh. So yeah,
So what's somebody under 25 called back then? A
um,
baby?
I'd
A child?
no, probably not. I'd have to look and see. In both in Greek, probably in Rome, in Latin too, but in Greek and in Hebrew, the words used to describe people often by that we translate as age, are more like social constructs.
Status.
So, yeah, kind of. So, in both Hebrew and in Greek, whether I call you a young person or not has more to do with whether or not you're married than it has to do with how many years you've actually been on the planet. So there's all kinds of complicated characteristics where you can't necessarily put all these terms into a time frame. There is a certain point at which you become old enough where even if you've never married, you don't get called a young man anymore. But the characteristics of the different
You're
words
called a
used.
lonely man.
Yeah, maybe you've got lots of friends. I don't know. I was talking to one of my nieces on social media today, who was complaining about being an adult now and never having their friends never having any time to do anything. They're like, of course not. When you're a kid, you work 6 hours a day and you have like 16 weeks off every year. When you become an adult, you work 8 hours a day and you only get like 2 or 3 weeks off every year. And then you get married and your wife or spouse takes up 2 of those hours every day plus a week every year. And then you have kids, and I mean, at that point, what time is even left? It's just, that's kind of the way it goes. But you know, if you never marry, you got a lot more time for friends. Anyway, okay, we're past time, but I want to wrap this up real quick. So, on the back, this is more getting into the stuff. Mark is the only book in the Bible that's written to be like a play, or it's the closest thing to a play that we get of the books of the Bible. And there's a strong argument that Mark was actually meant to be read out loud. It was not meant to sit and read it. It was meant to be either performed or at least orated. There are a whole set of themes, and I encourage you to keep this with you as we're reading and look for these themes. In Jesus, God is faithful to God's promises. There is a theme of shalom, which means healing and wholeness, and that especially applies to those who are suffering or marginalized. There's a cost of discipleship. There's a price to be paid for following Jesus. And the kind of disciple that you are depends on the kind of Messiah that you envision. Where we often tend to think in terms of either good versus evil or order versus chaos, there's an argument to be made that in Mark, the tension is between creation versus anti-creation. Part of that is in the heavy characteristic of expelling demons. There are as many stories about expelling demons in Mark as there are in Matthew, and Mark is half as long. So that it's a pretty concentrated quantity of demon expulsions. We get less in Mark, and there's none in John at all. The devil shows up in John, but we don't get any casting out of demons in John. Jesus' ministry brings the kingdom, and along with it, hostile response. So people don't like Jesus' ministry. And then, as I already mentioned, the importance of three. The number three comes up a lot. The structure, these next parts are going to take a little while to go through. So I'm going to pause there, and we're gonna take a look at the structure of John when we get started. We'll come back and start next time. I'll put a little mark. So, with that, we're going to close with the Lord's Prayer. So let us pray. Our
Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
And if we don't forgive us, right? All right. Thanks for being here with me in person. Thanks for joining us online. We'll be back again next week, and we'll pick up where we left off. Peace be with you.
Cassandra,